Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind Headlines. In this programme tonight we will be discussing the formal apology in the form of a report published by the Israeli Defence Force known as the IDF on their massive intelligence failure on the build-up to the worst mass terrorist attack in Israel's history and the consequences that took place as a result of Israel's intelligence failure on October the 7th. Regan, it's great to have you back from Israel for what is sadly a distressing programme as we unpack this formal apology on behalf of the Israeli Defence Force and their report looking at the mass intelligence failures that occurred prior to October the 7th and during October the 7th, which, as we know, was the largest massacre of Jewish people we've seen since the Holocaust over 80 years ago.
Well, Simon, in many ways it feels like this report is a formalization of what was all too apparent from the 7th of October, and since then it is solidifying in people's minds the root of responsibility for what went so drastically wrong on that day. We have to make there's no confusion over this. Hamas bears sole responsibility for the evil, depraved actions of raping, looting, pillaging, mass murder, abduction, brutalization, desecration of Israel, its civilians, others as well, just going about their day-to-day lives. It affected Jews, Muslims, Druze, people who are Christians across the board of Israel's society, and among its civilians, not a single sector was left unaffected, untouched, and unmaimed by Hamas's brutality. Yet at the same time, for the sake of lessons to be learned, this report is critical in its presentation and in its findings that actually there could have been more done to be aware, to in some way inhibit that incursion that occurred on what was Simchat Torah at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles. And I think if lessons are not learned, we could see a similar tragedy repeat itself.
Absolutely. And you've just come back from Israel, Regan. So just share with us your thoughts on how Israelis are going through, because you must have been in Israel during one of Israel's toughest weeks, particularly knowing that the Bibi's family had come back and that they had that long convoy to actually have the memorial service for the Bibi's brothers, Kafir, 10-month-old baby, and also Ariel, who was only 4 years old, toddler, when they were murdered in captivity by Hamas, and of course their mother, Shiri, and of course leaving Yarden without a family. Just share with us the kind of somber mood that you experienced in Israel.
Well, it hits you as soon as you go. I mean, you've been there through that corridor as you're arriving at Ben Gurion, as you see the posters of the hostages, and it's encouraging in that since October the 7th, I've been now. I believe this was the fourth time since then I've managed to return. And it's good to see, there's fewer and fewer posters. There's fewer and fewer hostage signs with those that have been freed, with those that whose bodies have been returned. So you have a sense of progression. But on this occasion, you're just hit by the emotion of that the people are going through, because the posters that remain, 39 of them, at least 39 of them are believed to be dead. It's not really clear who's who. The rest, you don't really know what condition they're in. We can only see some of the psychological torture that many are under. Who can forget the two young men who were brought to the hostage release point and given the impression that this is their day of freedom, and then they're forced to watch as they are left and their friends are released. The psychological impact of that is just absolutely horrifying. But then as you go along, as you head toward the immigration at Ben Gurion Airport, you suddenly see the posters of the Bybes family, and you see all of the toys, all of the pictures and stuff that's been left. The loss of this family, and then the loss of, you can think of Eli Sharabi's family as well, similar. It's all reopened wounds. Another family that lost their father, his body returned just in the past week. His 18-year-old, there's a horrifying video that many saw on the day. They had killed his 18-year-old daughter in cold blood. And, it's impossible as a father to not see your own children in that sort of situation and scenario. His hands are covered in the blood of his daughter, his other two younger children trembling with fear. And, it's very difficult, Simon, to keep from being overcome with extreme feelings of anger over this. It's something you have to constantly keep in check. As you walk through Ben Yehuda Street, you see, I saw orange balloons in memory of the Bybes family. You see stickers everywhere commemorating the lives of fallen soldiers. And you look at them, and they're like 18, 19 years old, 21 years old, some toward the end of their military careers. And you see the dates commemorating when they were fallen. Many of them fell on the 7th of October. And, the outpouring of love for the nation, for these ones, and yet this prevailing sense of numbness that this could have been stopped.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my heart has been breaking as well, but to be there must have been extremely difficult. But you can communicate to us, and you can communicate to our viewers as well what Israel's going through, and I think that's so important. So let's highlight now some of the key findings in this report published by the IDF on their colossal intelligence failure to prevent October the 7th. So we see here, for example, that failure to respond fast enough to the sheer evil and terror that was unfolding on October 7th as Israeli civilians were being murdered, tortured, mutilated, raped and kidnapped on what was the biggest massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. That was over 80 years ago. Because of Israel's military failures, Hamas and the evil associates were able to run amok, murdering more than 1,000 civilians, more than 400 military personnel, and abducting 251 hostages. The IDF Gaza division was overwhelmed for much of that day, and it took until 12 p.m. on October the 7th for any reinforcements to arrive on the scene. The painful report acknowledges that overconfidence and flawed intelligence culture hampered the IDF's response on October the 7th, something that Hamas had actually been planning for 6 years, dating back to 2016. And what lessons will Israel learn, and what lessons will the IDF learn from the horrors of October the 7th?
The reality of the scriptural reminder, I think, is important to center our program in. Simon, you have for us Zechariah 2, verse 8 and 9. What does it say?
For thus says the Lord of hosts, he sent me after glory to the nations which plunder you. For he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. For surely I will shake my hand against them, and they shall become spoil for their servants. Then you will know the Lord of hosts has sent me.
Well, the term, of course, Lord of hosts, Lord of armies, that's there. It's so important that we recognize in this situation, which Zechariah is speaking, the relevance of that to the present day. He remains the same. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And though Hamas felt that it achieved a significant victory on October the 7th, and wound and mar and destroy though it did, It cannot stand against the Lord God of heaven and earth, the Lord God of Israel, the Lord of hosts, who has promised that the nations which seek to plunder Israel themselves will be plundered and themselves will face just restitution. This new report published by the IDF on its failures on October the 7th, it's something that's very important, Simon, and just on a level of conscience and a level of morality, I think it highlights the integrity of the IDF. Very few, you can't see Hamas ever saying, yeah, no, we got this abysmally wrong. When have we ever seen an apology to Gaza? They've never apologized for any of the actions that have led to the rampant destruction across that city, the loss of life that's occurred. There's not been a sense of, yeah, we called this wrong. We have brought the hell on earth to Gaza as a result of our actions on the 7th. You're never going to see that. There's never going to be an admission of failure. It does not matter how many of its leaders it loses or has lost, it will never back down. But the IDF has recognized its failure. It's spoken of overconfidence among senior commanders, flawed intelligence culture, which hampered its response. Over 7 years of Hamas planning what resulted in this debacle on October the 7th, in which the IDF has formally apologized for, speaking of itself as having committed a historic failure on October the 7th. It revealed the plan for this massacre to be carried out was ongoing for at least 7 years, with the Army's internal inquiry into the disaster concluding this past Thursday that its senior leadership was comprehensively duped by the terror group into thinking that it lacked intent and capacity to launch a full-scale attack. It also revealed how opportunities to thwart the terror operation were missed on the night before it began, with officers judging the warning signs as not time-critical. It critiqued a flawed intelligence culture based on assumptions of certainty and fact, with commanders becoming addicted to certain types of intelligence. The detailed lessons learned exercise found that the IDF's Gaza division was overwhelmed for much of the day, that it took until approximately 12 noon for any reinforcements to arrive on the scene. Caught up personally in fighting street battles against Hamas, senior officers were unable to build a coherent picture of what was happening and were forced to rally their troops using mobile phones and Google Maps. The IDF failed in its first and foremost mission to protect Israel's borders and protect Israeli civilians, according to a senior military official. Far too many civilians died that day, asking in their hearts, where is the IDF? We completely understand that.
And it goes on to say this is covered extensively by the Daily Telegraph, and the Telegraph says that ordered by the Israeli military top brass, the inquiry publication is likely to heap more pressure on the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to launch a wider probe into the political failings that led to the attack, which has so far been stalled several times. It says it accompanies 41 individual investigations into specific incidences that took place on October 7th, which in recent days senior officers have been presenting to the survivors and also to the communities affected. So we have a CBN news report that looks back at that horrific day on October the 7th, which was the biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel's modern history.
The story of October 7th continues to unfold as new materials captured inside Gaza and Israeli territory are exposed. Vehicles, weapons, pictures, and clips, most of them made by Hamas and Islamic Jihad through their GoPros, help to tell the story of that fateful day. CBN News was given a look at some of the items. One of the most shocking things is how Israel's enemies instilled hatred of the Jews in the young for years, as displayed in these children's books. After the initial attack that morning, civilian mobs, including children and the elderly, joined the terrorists. Attackers came equipped with cameras on their foreheads and chests to document the rampage. On one of the terrorists killed in Ofakim, soldiers found a guide instructing them to focus on taking video of combat, killing, and captured prisoners, then explaining how to put all of it on social media. A 10-minute film compilation focuses on the attacks at the Nova Festival and in the communities surrounding the Gaza Strip. Some invaders carried UNRWA and international identification, while a handwritten note from one commander found in Sderot describes their enemy as an incurable disease that can only be dealt with by decapitation and uprooting hearts and livers. And an Arabic cheat sheet told how to say phrases in Hebrew like "take off your clothes." Many items add to the gruesome story, including kidnapping kits containing a stun gun similar to a taser, zip ties, a tourniquet, and drugs to calm down their victims. There was a Kalashnikov with a bayonet, machetes to cut off organs, which they did very systematically. There's a map of the layout of Kibbutz Be'eri, where more than 100 were killed and 30 taken hostage.
I really wish I could say that I was shocked, but unfortunately I'm not. Islamic fundamentalists, jihadists, have always said it's about, the Saturday people first and then the Sunday people. So first it's about killing the Jews, and then it's about coming for the Christians. Whatever we see that they try to inflict on us, we know that it's going to happen next in the Christian world.
Ari Gottesman also viewed the materials. After seeing them, he spoke of being moved by seeing plans which dated back years alongside the actual events.
Which means this wasn't just an overnight response to something. No, this was a methodological, planned, ongoing attack with not a focus on soldiers or military gains of strategic value, but rather just to sow terror, just to harm innocent people, to target people in their beds, in their homes, their pets.
Gedalia Bloom, director of the Heartland Initiative Public Diplomacy Program, says seeing the artifacts and physical evidence made him realize that this is not just a local conflict.
This is a global incident that had support from all over the world. Those people who are physically arming the Hamas terrorists, giving them the intelligence they need, and supporting them, whether it be UNRWA funding, Iranian intelligence. This should be seen as it really is, that this is a war against the West and Israel's at the front lines.
Bloom believes instead of trying to use this evidence to convince those who deny the attack, Israel should use it to bolster those who love and support Israel.
We need to stop playing defense and start playing offense and start winning more. That's also my big takeaway, is that we need to use this in order to strengthen our own resolve and to build better capabilities to strengthen Israel.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Ramat Sharon, Israel.
The Telegraph reports that until the morning of October the 7th, Israel's military considered Gaza a secondary threat. It was much more concerned and devoted its manpower accordingly to the danger posed by Hezbollah on its northern border and the wider menace of Iran. There were also the reality of the ever-simmering tension in the occupied West Bank as well, is how the Telegraph refers to it as there in Judea and Samaria. But given that Gaza was openly run by a jihadist terror group which swore death to Israel in its founding charter, and not just death to Israel, death to Jews. The Jews will continue to inhabit the land until Islam eradicates them. That's its whole idea. How did the IDF then allow this to happen? Simon, we are not, well, I don't know, we're not military experts, you and I, but we were talking about this months before it happened, that we were on the cusp of seeing mass conflict with Hamas, in Gaza.
Absolutely.
What
And
we saw
I
just
suppose
2 years
the big
before.
difference is this one, is that this report is only from the Israeli Defense Force.
Right.
We have yet to have an inquiry produced by the government and the government's response to this one. And in the aftermath, or prior to October the 7th, the nation of Israel was divided. Israel was at war with itself over judicial reform.
Yeah.
The current Israeli government, made up of kind of extreme religious right individuals and ministers, brought a spirit of confusion into the nation. The nation was tearing itself apart. And of course, this would have added to and contributed to Hamas looking at this opportunity to attack. We also saw that senior members of the IDF, particularly in the Israeli Air Force, refused to serve under this government at the time. And Israel was end up sleepwalking into this disaster because they didn't recognize the threats and the plans posed by Hamas and Hamas's intention, nor did they really appreciate the capacity for Hamas to carry out what they did. And this is why this report is so important, because it brings it to light. It's brutally honest. I don't know of any other kind of Western military that would publicly produce such a report, put it out in the public domain, where they are effectively criticizing their own actions. I mean, some of the stuff it says is really quite frightening here. It says documents and other intelligence gathered in Gaza since the start of the war have, the military says, allowed analysts to build up a detailed timeline of the plot. It believes that the fundamental concept of a mass terrorist attack to achieve liberation was first settled upon in November 2016.
Let's have a look at that just from November 2016, this timeline of Hamas's planning. It's quite enlightening. November 2016, we see the concept formed that the fundamental idea of a mass attack to achieve so-called liberation was first decided, according to the IDF. So this goes back to 2016, November of 2016. It would become known as Al-Aqsa flood, and the idea is we're going to overpower Israel. We're going to launch a mass surprise attack that is going to shock, overpower, and instill awe, and it will take us all the way to Al-Quds, to Jerusalem, was the idea. July 2017 sees the plot begin with an initial plan being worked on. From July 2019, Hamas had signed off on the plan with the proposals that had begun being approved, and just it was a case of biding time, essentially. In August of 2021, the plot was accelerated with a more detailed operational plan being brought forward for 2021. And in early 2022, Hamas established a readiness committee. Between 22 and 23, Hamas continued to lurk in various ways, weighing up the opportune moment to launch a surprise attack on Israel. I mean, we can't forget as well that there was, in the same time frame, several thousand rockets that Hamas sought to launch, and that, perhaps we could look at that as almost a smokescreen. That was what they were doing. It failed abysmally, but there was this plan, this devilish plot going on in the background.
Oh, absolutely, but it's also interesting, isn't it? August 2021, the plot accelerated.
Yeah.
That has to be in connection with Biden's disastrous military withdrawal from Afghanistan. So therefore thinking that America is a paper tiger, America won't come to Israel's rescue.
And then we have the event as it unfolded, 6:30, 7 a.m. on October the 7th. Hell unleashed with the first wave of attacks, seeing 1,500 Hamas terrorists stream through Gaza's security fence and head to nearby villages. From 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. on October the 7th, there was a second wave of around 2,500 fighters aiming to push further into Israel and target various Air Force bases. This is about the time that I first became aware of it. What would have been about 6 a.m. maybe our time on that morning.
8 a.m., yeah.
9 a.m. to 4 p.m., This continued with many Palestinian civilians joining the attack. The attack's final wave seeing atrocities committed by terrorists and some ordinary Palestinians as well. With an initial plan, what we see being that had been worked on, the plan that was there and approved from 2019, we then begin to see the buttons pushed to enact this absolute depravity.
No, absolutely. So let's have a look at this CBN news report looking at the intelligence failures to actually protect one of Israel's kibbutzes that was devastated and destroyed by Hamas back on October the 7th.
The Israeli military released a report on its own conduct and failures at Kibbutz Be'eri on October 7th, including a diagram of the battle.
That day, the IDF failed in its mission to protect the citizens of Israel.
Be'eri was one of the communities hardest hit by Hamas, with more than 100 Israelis slaughtered and more than 30 hostages taken that day, including 11 still in captivity.
We were not prepared for the murderous terrorist attack by Hamas, involving thousands of terrorists who infiltrated the country at dozens of points at the same time.
Terrorists killed Meir Zerbiv's brother and sister. He's furious with the IDF for not quickly charging into the kibbutz to stop the slaughter.
The terrorists broke into the kibbutz at 6:30 in the morning, and around, I think, 10 to 10:30, forces arrived at the entrance to the kibbutz, and they were asked to enter. They didn't want to enter. They said they weren't given the order to enter.
Israel's prime minister has rejected an official probe into October 7th while a war is going on. But this week, his own defense minister called for just such an investigation.
We require a probe at the national level, a probe that will clarify the facts. It needs to check me, Minister of Defense. It needs to check the Prime Minister.
Joining us on this week's edition of Behind Headlines, we're joined by Stefan Silva, who's not only a Messianic leader, he's also an IDF officer and reservist based up in the Carmel region of northern Israel. Stefan, it's always a pleasure to see you on Behind Headlines, and so please, you can join us today.
Likewise, Simon, thanks, and it's great to be with you again.
Stefan, please just give us your initial thoughts to this report that was published by the Israeli Defense Force, or the IDF, last week, that really did say that October the 7th was a massive military intelligence failure by the IDF prior to October the 7th's invasion by Hamas, but also in the after of it and the mopping up operation. Share with us your thoughts on what is essentially a huge, massive intelligence failure by the Israeli Defense Force.
Yeah, so I think it's an honest, it's a full report, very extensive. It's a brutally honest report, and it really does expose the deep and the critical errors that ran deep within the IDF and especially within the intelligence units for a number of years, and culminated in this terrible attack, this terrible failure that cost the lives of so many people, and it's still ongoing, and we're still not out of the woods, and obviously the repercussions of what happened are going to continue to be felt for years and for decades to come. You know, I think the intelligence community prided themselves on their superiority, on their ability to foretell any kind of imminent strategic threat against Israel, which is essentially their ultimate mission and their goal. There's a lot of confidence in technology and all kinds of high-tech abilities, which, that they do exist. And yet there was a terrible, terrible failure. There's no doubt that the government also had a very significant influence in all the misconceptions that filtered down and I think aided into the intelligence community missing the critical signals that were definitely there and indicated what Hamas's real intentions were. But obviously this report primarily is an IDF report, so it focuses on the IDF. It's not intended to investigate the government. But it is a brutally honest report and investigation, and I think the positive thing in general is that the lessons are being learned, even if it has been done the hard way.
Stefan, share with us a little bit about the depravity of Hamas and how they were able to pull off this 7-year planning and strategizing of October the 7th. How is it that they were able to deceive Israel and the IDF into thinking that they had neither the intent or capability of launching such a tragic invasion of Israel?
Yeah, so a lot of effort was invested by Hamas to hide their true intentions. And on their side, from the materials that have been discovered in Gaza through the war and the military forces that have been in Gaza and have put their hands on these materials and brought them back, and it's been analyzed, there was significant and meticulous planning for the October 7th attacks. Interestingly, it was almost executed twice before, in September of 2022, in the Fall Feast, so exactly a year before when it actually happened, and then again in Passover of 2023, so earlier that same year. That same year, the Chief of Staff spent Passover Eve at one of the bases in the Gaza division area. And Hamas knew about that, they discovered that, and they thought that the IDF were preparing like an ambush against their plan, a counteroffensive. And so they canceled it and eventually ended up pulling the trigger literally in October of 2023. But what Hamas did was it begins at the government level. So Hamas caused Israel's government, prime minister, defense minister, all of the senior ministers to think that Hamas preferred stability rather than war. Unfortunately, our nation, our government, was a channel for millions and millions of US dollars that came from Qatar and was sent through Israel into the Gaza Strip, into the hands of Hamas, because the government believed that Hamas were more interested in feeding their people instead of building a terror army. So that's where it begins. But then, we see that was filtered down obviously into the intelligence community, into the senior military officers within the IDF and specifically in the Gaza division. But we see also that Hamas leaders were very, very rigid in their compartmentalization of their plans. Only very, very few people knew about the full plans and the magnitude of the attack and all of the facets and all of the entire plan. Most of the units and most of the commanders involved from Hamas's side, they knew only fragments of the plan that were relevant to them. They didn't know the whole picture. We know now that Hamas, for a long period of time, used human messengers, people, to pass information and to relay messages instead of using the digital means of communication, phones, computers, whatever it may be, because they knew that they were being monitored by the IDF and they could be hacked by Israel's security forces. Hamas gathered a lot of intelligence over many years of Israel's defense systems, of the bases and the layouts, of the critical systems locations, communications, cameras, remote firing systems, locations of forces, and then the training. So the training was done, but it was done in small portions so as not to raise any kind of alarm. We didn't see a force of hundreds or thousands of terrorists training on a given scenario. It was always smaller units. So there was a lot of work done by Hamas to kind of break it up, to cover it, and to try and hide the magnitude of these plans. And they did indeed succeed, at least initially.
So Stefan, share with us your thoughts in this report that the IDF High Command ignored the warnings on October the 6th, with unusual activity taking place in Gaza next to Israel's border. And the assumption was that Hamas don't have the intent nor the capacity to carry out what they did on October the 7th, which proved to be false. Share with us your thoughts on how potentially October the 7th could have been avoided. had the Israeli High Command taken their intelligence seriously?
Yes, so intelligence is always a delicate matter. The point of intelligence is to try and understand what the enemy is doing now and what they're planning to do. But there always is an element of uncertainty. Nothing is 100%, and it's very easy to judge these things in hindsight once the complete picture becomes clear and known. On the night of October 6th, there were suspicious signs that something could be happening. There were several signs that have been, reported in various locations, and they were communicated to the chief of staff and to several other senior military generals, but not to all of them. And there was a lack of communication between them, and not everybody knew all of the information. But along with those suspicious signs, there were also calming indications that were coming from Gaza as well. And like I said, I think a large part of the failure has to do with the communication, or the lack of communication, between the high command generals. The fact that the defense minister, the minister of defense, and the prime minister, while their defense or their IDF liaisons were updated about what was occurring, the suspicious signs, the calming signs, and obviously, every assessment has to take into account all of those factors. But although their liaisons were aware of the situation, they didn't actually wake and inform the Minister of Defense or the Prime Minister of what was going on. And ultimately, between the suspicious indications and the calming signs, and in light of the overall misconception that Hamas was not aiming for another wide-scale military clash with Israel, then the alert was not raised to the level it should have. And that ultimately caused the situation to remain as it was. There were a few forces that were put onto alert. I think one Shin Bet unit was sent to Gaza, to the Gaza area, but again, none of that added up to the actual plans that were being devised, simply because an attack of this magnitude had never been taken into account. It was not one of the scenarios that Israel or the IDF had prepared for. And so there was a failure to do that.
Stefan, one of the biggest questions that's being asked, that we've heard asked for now the past year and a half, is why did it take the IDF over 6 hours to get down to the south of Israel to launch its counter-offensive?
So it's quite simple. I think the overarching reason is because the government and the military had a misconception that Hamas did not desire another wide-scale war. There had been relative calm in the previous months that reinforced that assumption. The defense systems that Israel had erected around the Gaza Strip, very extensive and very expensive, basically allowed, quote unquote, for less soldiers to be present around the Gaza Strip in general. There were only about 670 soldiers around the Gaza Strip on the eve of October 6th. There were 1,175 Hamas terrorists in the first wave that attacked Israel and infiltrated Israel. So the ratio there was 2-to-1 for Hamas. So that just shows you how the military was underprepared for the attack and for what actually happened. Additionally, it was a holiday season. It was a Sabbath day, and not only was it a Sabbath day, but it was also the 8th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And so generally in the military on weekends, and especially on holidays, they try to let as many soldiers go home on leave as possible. And so all of those other factors just contributed to releasing more forces probably than were given leave as usual. And this caused the number of troops on alert at that time to be lower than usual. Also, the attack, it commenced at dawn after many had late nights. The soldiers that were there around Gaza, also those that had been given leave to go home, many of them had been out probably on holiday meals with their families, maybe going out and celebrating afterwards, and had probably gone to sleep later. And, it simply takes time to muster troops from all over the country, to gather them at one point, to gear them up, and to mobilize them into battle. I believe that the initial forces arrived, very small special force units who are quite kind of more mobile and able to move around more quickly at 8:47 a.m., but which is a couple of hours after the attack commenced. But the mass forces, the large battalions, only arrived several hours later, and it simply takes time to muster the troops, to gather them together, and to send them into battle. And those were those critical hours after 6:29 a.m. on the morning of October 7th.
So Stefan, thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines today from Israel. It's also a reminder that all our viewers need to keep the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, in our prayers. I mean, the men and women that serve with the IDF serve with absolute distinction, and this new generation, the Generation Z, have done an incredible job, and they've fought like lions in the aftermath of October the 7th. But just give us one kind of sentence, will you, before we go, Stefan, on how Israel needs to not trust in horses or chariots, but to trust in the Lord and his protection.
Yeah, well, in Psalms we read how we are to lift our eyes to the hills, or maybe in other words, to lift our eyes to the heavens, because our help comes from the Lord, from he who sits in the heavens, the maker of heaven and earth. And we have a strong military, we have a good military, despite everything that's happened. I think Israel, the IDF, has proven that in the months since October the 7th, 2023. But ultimately, we as a nation need to lift our eyes to the Lord God of Israel, because he is the keeper of Israel, and our prayer is that that will happen soon.
Well, we're very thankful to Stefan Silver for his time and his expertise in this. Simon, the report that we've been discussing refers particularly to Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of the attack, who has been slain now, thankfully, by the IDF, as someone Israel had believed to be pragmatic. And what they meant by that was they felt that they weren't actually looking to launch anything major scale. The pragmatism would view and recognize that Gaza would lose out too much if something large scale was to occur. How desperately wrong they were, but it also lays bare how Israel took the wrong message from its 2021 Guardian of the Walls operation in Gaza, erroneously believing that it had left Hamas in a state of operational distress, whereas in reality the terror group had been conserving its firepower and was galvanized. The result was that Israel arranged its manpower, roughly 4 battalions, in order to deal with a small handful of potential infiltrations by Hamas fighters, thinking that rocket fire would be the main threat, for which, of course, there was the state-of-the-art Iron Dome interception system. This, plus the $1 billion or so they had spent on their high-tech perimeter wall, made them feel safe with a relatively small number of troops in the area. The report found that the IDF had excessive confidence in this barrier and as such reduced troop numbers to conserve resources. "We thought that was good enough," said the official. "We thought that any major shift in the picture would be preceded by an intelligence update." The assessment was Hamas did not want a full-scale war and that it lacked capacity for an attack on this scale. And this led to opportunity after opportunity to stop the October 7th mass terror attack being missed.
Absolutely. So the report also says that the IDF admitted that during the night, this is the night of October the 6th going into October the 7th, there were early warning signs. In particular, they noticed a mass activation of SIM cards as well as changes in normal behavior. They said that they did also receive tip-offs from human sources on the ground, even in a frank lessons learned exercise. That is not the sort of thing the IDF will discuss. Either way, phone calls were made, including to the commander of the Northern Brigade of the Gaza Division, and about 4 in the morning. But at the end, it was decided that whatever was going on in Gaza, it was not time critical, perhaps an exercise by Hamas or an activity in preparation for an imagined IDF operation. One IDF official said the following: "We thought something may be going on, but nothing on the scale of October the 7th, because we never thought that was an option. And then what happened then on October the 7th at 6:26 a.m. 2023 was that Hamas held the two trump cards craved by military commanders throughout history: surprise and overwhelming force. The IDF believes that in the following hours, between 5,000 and 5,600 terrorists passed through the security fence to wreak havoc, murder, abduct under a barrage of 4,694 rockets and mortars.
The first wave saw about 1,500 hardened Hamas fighters stream through the security fence at about 6:30 a.m. to 7 a.m., heading straight for nearby Israeli villages in Kibbutz Sim as well as IDF outposts. The second wave, launched between 7 and 9 a.m., comprised about 2,500 fighters and had the aim of pushing further into Israel, with ambitious targets such as Beersheba, Ashkelon, and various Air Force bases. This included Hamas and other terror groups who had not been given prior warning of the attack, but who quickly got involved, wanting a slice of the action. The third wave started at about 9 a.m. and included a mixture of terrorists and ordinary Palestinians who had heard the call of Hamas's top brass, Mohammed Deif, at 7:58 a.m. to join the slaughter of about 1,500 individuals in total. "Whoever has a gun, get out because its time has come," Deif had said. "Whoever has no gun, get a knife or an axe." In total, it is thought that there were 59 points of infiltration into Israel. The first wave of fighters are thought to have been the most focused, murdering with abandon and also kidnapping more than 250 hostages in those early hours, dragging them back into Gaza by roughly midday. With subsequent waves not pushing as far into Israel as had been intended, they succeeded in flooding the area known as the Gaza envelope with heavily armed terrorists, taking up defensive positions around key junctions and concurbations, thus making it a nightmare for military response.
And we now have our report of when we were in Israel and very close to the Gaza Strip to actually see the destruction caused by Hamas on October the 7th. And these were with the partygoers' cars as they tried to escape the unfolding horror committed by Hamas on October the 7th. Just to let you know that this image and this video is distressing, but it's also important. Take a look. Hi, this is Simon Barrett of Revelation TV in the UK. What you can see behind me is one of the cars that was attacked on October the 7th, the worst mass terrorist attack in Israel's history, where Israel was confronted by approximately 2,000 to 3,000 Hamas terrorists on that day. You can see the carnage they've done with the cars behind me, with these Iranian-supplied grenades that ignite and inflame these cars and actually burn them to ashes. And for those people who really do question whether October the 7th happened, well, here's the crime scene. Here's the evidence of the mass murders that took place on October the 7th. And it's a reminder of the world to wake up, to realize this is terrorism. This is the worst kind of terrorism that we've seen in decades, certainly comparable to 9/11. And the magnitude of the destruction that occurred on October the 7th is nothing less than absolutely horrific and evil. And you can see with the evidence behind the total carnage caused by Hamas back on October the 7th. I want to take you back to October the 7th, and you can see behind me how this beautiful black Audi has been absolutely shot to bits by Hamas terrorists, and around us we see the absolute carnage caused by Hamas on October the 7th. This is real. This happened, and you can see car after car after car just parked up here with their windscreens shot to bits, the tyres burnt out. It's a scene of absolute carnage and absolute terror. And to be one of those Israeli drivers on October the 7th when Hamas carried out this terrorist attack must have been absolutely horrific. And the world needs to know what happened on October the 7th. This is equivalent of what happened in the Shoah or the Holocaust, to realise the true magnitude of the scale of this attack by Hamas back on October the 7th. As you can see, this was until recently a crime scene. This is the biggest crime scene I've ever seen. I'm sure the biggest crime scene that you've ever seen. But I want to show you this car because this just brings to life how personal this is. Because in this car, looks like these were just in Israeli day trippers. They packed their bags for the beach. And then you can see in the back seat is a children's book. And then in the front, personal items with pens, which makes it very, very personal of what happened. That these people did not expect to see what they saw on October the 7th. And it just brings that personal element that these were people, real people, who in one moment their life was just taken. And it describes really what the Bible talks about, is suddenly people are saying peace and safety, and suddenly there is no safety. We can see this with here, this sudden terrorist attack on October the 7th by Hamas, and that these are real people who drove these cars on October the 7th. So what we can see in this car is that these poor people had absolute no chance of survival, going on a family day out to the beach to the south, and then to be confronted by Hamas terrorists on October the 7th is just beyond horrific. Words can't describe the magnitude of what we're seeing here, the total destruction by Hamas, killing innocent Israeli civilians in their car who had no self-defense, no way of getting out of those situations. And you wonder why Israel is launching a military operation into Gaza to destroy Hamas. Well, it's because of this.
The situation as it deteriorated, Simon saw many IDF officers also embroiled in hand-to-hand close quarters combat, unable to help with the broader tactical picture. No fewer than 3 brigade commanders were killed in action in the early hours, several battalion commanders, of course a number of company commanders, which left many troops effectively leaderless and without clear intelligence and strategy. For at least 10 hours we ceased to be efficient enough and were overrun by terrorists, according to one IDF official. By 3 p.m. hundreds of terrorists still at large in Israeli territory. And we see at this point in time, with so much ammo, RPGs, machine guns, mortars, grenades, terrorists in one room firing out at IDF and families sheltering in the next room, the situation became very, very difficult. Air support was also challenging as well, with an attack helicopter and armed UAVs arriving at the scene relatively early in the morning, but in reality, without any coherent military structure, it was impossible to engage the enemy in any accurate way. And the question of friendly fire casualties among civilians and soldiers has haunted the military since October the 7th, not least because apologists for Hamas have sought to blame the heavy death toll on the Israeli counterattack.
And Hamas's terrorist objectives on October the 7th were the following. 1, to create panic, mayhem and destruction on southern Israel. Their plan was also to mobilize Israeli Arabs to attack their neighboring Jewish communities, and also that those Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria, known under the Palestinian Authority, would launch an intifada, and that the Iranian regime would use their terror proxies, Hamas, to attack northern Israel on the same day, and this would lead to the Iranian regime attacking Israel. But thankfully, because of God's grace and protection, that never happened on October the 7th.
We have seen much soul searching since that time, also with Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi effectively sacking himself just a few months ago in contrition for the IDF's failures once he felt that the war in the north and south was under control. Deep soul searching exercise among the IDF leadership as they're acknowledging overconfidence and not enough doubt in their own systems. We've seen the IDF failure in response, and there's going to be more, I'm sure, that comes out as this report is processed. But ultimately, the IDF failure to prevent the mass terror attack by Hamas on October 7th to respond to the scale of the attack has to go down as one of the biggest military intelligence failures in Israel's modern history. October the 7th fell on the same weekend as the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur attack, the direct result also of Israeli intelligence failures. Israel and the IDF must learn not to be complacent in the face of such evil intent, Hamas and Islamic extremism. And yet we have seen, Simon, a miraculous turnaround with the IDF winning stunning victories against Hamas and Hezbollah. But ultimately, we cannot put our trust in chariots.
Amen to that. Thank you so much for your excellent contribution, Regan. And I want to thank you for watching this program at home. It is a very brutal and honest report put together by the IDF, looking at their huge intelligence failures on October the 7th. But the one thing about Israel is that they might be hit first, but you can guarantee that they have the God of Israel on their side. So continue to pray for those brave and courageous men who serve with the IDF. So thank you for watching Behind the Headlines.